Everyone thinks their home is theirs, safe, sacred, untouchable, until the day it is. I had spent years building my little cabin at the edge of the forest, the kind of place where the morning fog curls around the pine trees and the wind whispers through the eaves. My hands had patched every crack in the walls, sanded every splinter in the floorboards, and painted the trim myself. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Mine in the way that matters, the way your heart belongs somewhere long before you can prove it to the world. So when I returned one crisp autumn morning and saw the gate swinging open, I froze. A realtor's car idled in the driveway. My stomach dropped into my shoes. The "for sale" sign I hadn't put up swayed lazily in the breeze, and my pulse slammed against my ribs like a warning drum. They'd done it again. The HOA, the very organization I had paid into, trusted, and obeyed for years. I knew their rules better than most residents, the bylaws memorized in the quiet nights when the cabin was too still, too perfect. But rules, I had learned, only mattered if you were the one bending to them. If someone else decided to bend you well, that was something else entirely. I stood there frozen, watching the realtor snap pictures and scribble notes, entirely oblivious, or perhaps entirely indifferent to my presence. My voice caught somewhere between fear and rage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm out and demand answers. But mostly I wanted to disappear into the forest and hide from the betrayal. How do you explain the betrayal of a place that holds your soul? The HOA had entered my home without permission. Let that sink in, not once, not by accident, but intentionally. They had shown my life, my sanctuary, to strangers as if it were some commodity they could trade. A cabin isn't just a roof over your head. It's the place where you burn memories into the walls, where the echo of your laughter lives long after you've left the room. And yet they treated it like an empty box, open for inspection. I clenched my fists so hard my nails bit into my palms. Every rational part of me screamed to call them, to demand an explanation. But another part, older, quieter, sharper, reminded me that calling would do nothing. Rules on paper don't always translate into justice in reality. Sometimes you have to protect what matters yourself. I remember walking the perimeter of my property that day, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the cold seeping through my boots. I measured the gate with my eyes, traced the chain dangling loosely, imagined the locks I could install, the barricades I could raise. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about control, dignity, and saying, "This is mine, not yours to manipulate." A memory flickered, my father, hammer in hand, showing me how to secure a latch so tight that no one could pry it open without breaking it. His voice was gruff but patient. "You can't always stop people from trying to take what's yours, but you can make it hard enough that they have to think twice." I knew what I had to do, not just for the cabin, but for me. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought the sturdiest padlock the hardware store had. I returned with the weight of determination pressing against my chest, every step heavier than the last. I looped the chain through the gate, testing the strength. The click of the lock sounded louder than it should have, echoing through the empty street like a declaration. I'm not letting anyone in without my permission. But that wasn't enough. I needed to reclaim the narrative. If the HOA wanted to control my story, I would write it myself. I went back inside, dug out an old wooden post, painted a crude yet defiant "for sale by owner" sign, and hammered it into the ground. Not in submission, but in assertion. Not a surrender, but a stand. Standing back, I felt a rush of emotions. Anger, yes, but also relief. There was power in claiming your own boundaries. Power in showing the world that you will not be moved without your consent. Even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant defying the very people who were supposed to uphold the community's rules. I don't know who the first passerby was driving down the quiet country road, but I remember the way the sun hit the sign, glinting off the chipped paint, and for the first time that day I felt seen. Not by the HOA, not by the realtor, but by myself. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in courtrooms or boardrooms. Sometimes they're fought quietly, with a lock, a sign, and a stubborn refusal to be erased. That day I learned that ownership isn't just legal. It's moral, emotional, spiritual. And sometimes protecting what is yours means standing in silence and daring the world to notice. Why do people assume their authority gives them the right to invade your life? That evening, the cabin felt smaller somehow. Shadows stretched across the walls like accusations. I couldn't stop picturing the realtor wandering through my living room, touching my things, imagining my life as just another transaction. Every mug in the cupboard, every faded photo on the wall, every shelf I had built with my own hands, they'd been on display without my consent. And the HOA, they'd done nothing to stop it. Worse, they'd orchestrated it. I sank into the armchair by the window, staring out at the locked gate. The padlock gleamed faintly in the twilight. It was small, a single line of defense against a world that sometimes forgets boundaries. Yet it felt like armor. Maybe I was being dramatic, but after everything, it was hard not to be. And then came the call. "Hello," my voice sounded tentative, unsure. "Good evening, this is the HOA management office. We've received a notice about your property," and the voice hesitated. "The lock on the gate." I leaned back, heart hammering, my throat tightened. They sounded concerned, angry, both. "Is there a problem with me protecting my property?" I asked carefully, testing the waters. There was a pause long enough for a calendar to flip. "Well, technically, there are rules about access for showings." I bit back a retort, feeling a swirl of anger and disbelief. Rules, access. They had no qualms about violating mine, but suddenly the law mattered. That night, sleep refused me. I walked the cabin's perimeter again, retracing every step, imagining every possible confrontation. The forest beyond the fence seemed quieter somehow, almost complicit. I remembered every long day I'd spent hammering nails, sawing boards, painting the siding. Every bead of sweat, every aching muscle, it had all led to this moment of violation. And now it was mine to defend. I found myself thinking about neighbors, the ones who smiled politely at the mailboxes or waved from behind white picket fences. Did they know what the HOA was capable of? Did they care? Or had they, like so many others, surrendered quietly, keeping their heads down and their voices soft? I didn't want that to be me. Not anymore. The next morning, the air was thick with the smell of damp leaves and pine needles. I could see footprints near the gate, unfamiliar and deliberate. Someone had tried. Someone had tested my defenses. My stomach sank. The realtor hadn't returned yet, but I could feel the tension building, a slow-burning fuse that promised confrontation. I grabbed a notebook and started scribbling, not just notes, but a plan. What could I do if they tried to force their way in? How would I assert my rights without escalating into a battle I might not win? But somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't just about legalities. It was about pride, dignity, and the principle of ownership. The principle that a home is sacred and intrusion, without permission, is a violation of the self. By mid-morning, a car rolled down the road, familiar, too familiar. The HOA's property manager stepped out, clipboard in hand, face carefully neutral. "We need to talk about the property," they said, voice calm, practiced. I felt a rush of defiance. "About my property or yours?" They blinked, taken aback, a tiny victory. I had already won the first round. I had control over the conversation. They lingered at the gate, pretending casual concern, but I could see it in their eyes, the calculations, the judgments. I held my ground, hand resting on the padlock, ready to step in front if necessary. My heart thumped, a drumbeat of fear and resolve. "You can't just," they started, but I cut them off. "I'm sorry, but this is my home, my rules. If anyone wants to see it, it will be on my terms." Silence, then a sigh that felt almost human, though I doubted it. They scribbled something on the clipboard and left, retreating down the winding road, leaving only the crunch of tires on gravel and a thin line of tension hanging in the air. I sank onto the porch steps, exhausted, but alive with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. I realized then that boundaries are a form of courage. Sometimes they are more than rules. They are shields against a world that doesn't respect ownership, privacy, or dignity. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. The HOA could try, the realtor could try, but the cabin was mine. My hands, my sweat, my memories were etched into every corner, and no amount of authority could erase that. But I also knew this was far from over. The lock and the sign were just the beginning. The true battle, emotional, psychological, and deeply personal, was just starting, and I had to be ready. Because sometimes the hardest fights don't end with a victory in court. They begin with a stand, a choice, and the quiet, unyielding courage to say, not today, not to you. Why does it always feel like the world is against you when you're only trying to protect what's yours? By the third day, the cabin had transformed from a quiet sanctuary into a... The padlock gleamed like a shield in the morning sun, but every shadow it cast seemed to whisper. They weren't done. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for me to falter. Every crunch of gravel outside the gate made my heart skip, every distant car engine a drumbeat of anxiety. The HOA sent another notice, official-looking, typed in cold, precise language that carried no warmth, no understanding. They claimed I was interfering with community operations and violating HOA rules by restricting access for authorized showings. My hands shook as I read the letter, not with fear, but with disbelief. They had already trespassed, yet now they were calling me the problem. It was absurd, cruel, and somehow familiar. I thought of every small injustice I had ever swallowed quietly. Every time a neighbor complained about noise I hadn't made, every time a rule was bent against me while bending over backwards for others. It all led to this moment, this perfect storm of violation and defiance, and something inside me snapped. I went outside and walked the perimeter again, taking in every detail. The worn path where the realtor's shoes had pressed into the grass, the paint on the fence chipped just slightly where someone had tried to pull it open, the way the sunlight hit the "For Sale by Owner" sign, making it glow like a warning. Every inch of this property held memory and labor, and I refused to let it be erased. That night I sat by the fireplace, staring at the flames as they danced and flickered. I thought about confrontation, about what it would take to make them understand. But then, a quieter thought crept in. Maybe they'd never understand. Maybe ownership, dignity, and respect were things you had to claim for yourself, no matter how many bylaws or forms or authority figures told you otherwise. The next morning I noticed something different. The neighboring cabins felt watchful, curtains twitched, cars lingered longer than usual. It was subtle but unmistakable. The word must have spread. The cabin with the locked gate, the owner who dared to defy the HOA. Some of it was curiosity, some judgment, but all of it reminded me that standing up comes with isolation. Isolation wasn't new to me. I'd felt it before in smaller doses when choices I made weren't understood, when loyalty and kindness were mistaken for weakness. But this isolation felt larger, more pressing. It pressed against my chest like a weight, testing my resolve. And yet even in that pressure I felt a strange pride. I was defending more than property. I was defending principle. By mid-afternoon, the HOA returned, unannounced this time. 2 representatives drove slowly up the road, clipboard in hand, faces neutral, yet their eyes glinted with expectation. I met them at the gate, the padlock catching the sunlight, a silent roar of defiance. "Again," one of them said, voice measured, almost bored. "Yes, again," I replied, keeping my tone steady, though my chest ached with tension. "This is my property. You will not enter without permission." They scribbled notes, shifted from foot to foot as if my very presence annoyed them. "You can't just..." "Stop," I said sharply. "I will not argue about my rights. If you wish to show the cabin, you will do it with my consent, not yours, mine." Silence fell like heavy fog. I watched as they exchanged glances, subtle yet meaningful. They were trying to gauge how far I would push, how much I could tolerate. And I realized something that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't just about a house. It was about control, power, and fear. They wanted to remind me that my voice, my boundaries, meant nothing unless they allowed it to. For a long moment, I considered stepping aside, letting them in, and ending this quietly. But then I remembered the mornings spent painting, the nights spent sanding floors, the countless moments where I had invested pieces of my soul into this cabin. I couldn't, not now, not ever. They left finally, though their departure felt more like a pause than a resolution. And as I watched their car disappear around the bend, a cold realization settled over me. This was just the beginning. The cabin had become more than a home. It was a statement, a challenge, and the people who sought to override me would stop at nothing to test my resolve. I could feel it in the empty driveway, in the creaking boards of the porch, in the wind that whispered through the pines like cautionary advice. I sank into the armchair by the window again, heart racing, mind restless. I knew there would be letters, meetings, and perhaps threats. I knew neighbors would gossip and the HOA would escalate. But I also knew something else, something vital. They could not touch the memories, the sweat, the love, the blood I had poured into this cabin. That belonged to me no matter what forms they filed or rules they cited. Sometimes the true power of standing up isn't in victory. It's in refusing to bend, even when bending would be easier, safer, quieter. It's in choosing dignity over convenience. And that day, as the shadows lengthened and the wind whispered through the trees, I made a quiet promise. No one would take this from me. Not the HOA, not strangers, not even the creeping fear inside me. Because some things are worth more than peace. Some battles are worth every tremor of anxiety, every pang of exhaustion, every whispered doubt. And my cabin was one of them. Why does standing up for yourself feel like walking a tightrope over fire? By the fourth day, the tension had become almost tangible. The cabin no longer felt like a safe haven. It felt like a stage, every creak of the floorboards a potential witness, every rustle of leaves a silent observer. I could hear the wind through the pines and swear it carried whispers of doubt and challenge, as if the forest itself was testing me. The HOA didn't waste time. That morning, a letter appeared under my door, crisp and official. They demanded access again, citing vague rules about community oversight and fair market evaluation. But it wasn't the words that cut deep. It was the assumption behind them, that I was an obstacle to be removed, rather than a human being with rights, history, and memories in every corner of my cabin. I crumpled the letter and let it fall to the floor. My hands shook not from fear, but from the simmering anger that had been building for days. Every inch of this cabin bore my fingerprint, my sweat, my patience, my mistakes, my triumphs. And they treated it like it was disposable, like it was just a backdrop for a transaction. I knew I couldn't stay passive. Locking the gate had been a start, hanging my own sign had been a statement. But words and locks were not enough against people who thrived on control. If they wanted a fight, I would make sure it was clear who owned the battlefield. I walked the perimeter again, inspecting the fence, the posts, even the ground itself. Small footprints marred the grass near the gate, evidence that someone had tried to test my defenses in the night. My stomach tightened as I realized this wasn't just a theoretical threat anymore. It was real. Someone had challenged me while I slept. That afternoon, I confronted the HOA representative again. I could see the surprise in their eyes when I met them at the gate, standing firm, arms crossed, eyes unwavering. "You can't just continue to block access," they said, clipboard in hand, voice clipped and measured. "I can," I replied, my tone steady, though my heart pounded like a drum. "Because this is my home, my rules, not yours, not the community's, mine." They scribbled on the clipboard, pretending detachment, but I could feel their irritation simmering beneath the surface. Every step they took, every word they uttered, carried the weight of authority trying to intimidate, to erode my confidence, to make me doubt myself. But I didn't. I had spent too long watching other people's boundaries be ignored, too long swallowing my anger in silence. This time I wouldn't bend. This time I wouldn't flinch. My hands gripped the padlock like a lifeline, a tangible reminder that I was not alone, even if everyone else seemed to believe otherwise. The representative lingered, then finally left, muttering under their breath. But the encounter left me shaken. I realized that the battle wasn't just with them. It was with every quiet voice in my head that had ever told me to comply, to be polite, to ignore injustice for the sake of peace. That voice had been silenced by fear before, but no more. As evening approached, I stood on the porch and watched the sun dip behind the trees. Shadows stretched long and thin, brushing across the cabin's walls like silent fingers. I realized the fight had changed me. I was no longer just a homeowner. I was a guardian. Every memory, every moment spent building this cabin was now part of a larger struggle, a testament to resilience, to self-respect, to the power of refusing to be erased. But it wasn't just about me. Neighbors had begun to notice. Some whispered as they passed, others stared openly from behind curtains. I could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their fascination. And somewhere hidden beneath their murmurs was a lesson. Courage is contagious, but it is also isolating. Standing up for yourself can inspire, but it can also make you a target. That night, as the wind howled through the pines and rattled the windows, I felt both fear and exhilaration. The battle was far from over. The HOA would escalate, the threats would grow, and the quiet tension of everyday life would transform into a continuous test of my resolve. But I also knew something vital. This was not just about property. It was about dignity, integrity, and the right to define your own boundaries. Sometimes the fight for your home mirrors the fight for your soul. And in that moment, standing alone on the porch, I realized I would fight, every day, every hour, every minute. Because some things are too precious to surrender. Some things cannot be measured in bylaws or letters or fees. And my cabin was one of them. How far would you go to protect something that defines you? By the 5th day, the cabin felt like it had taken on a life of its own. Every floorboard creak, every whisper of wind through the pine needles, every shadow cast by the late afternoon sun seemed to echo my growing unease. The fight wasn't just legal anymore. It had become personal. Every fiber of my being screamed that surrender was unacceptable, that the cabin wasn't just a building but an extension of my very self. The HOA's letters became more frequent, each one sharper, sterner, dripping with implication. They threatened fines, community sanctions, even legal action. They spoke in formal tones, but I could hear the underlying impatience, the assumption that I would eventually fold, that my stubbornness would be worn down by bureaucracy and intimidation. But I wasn't folding. That morning I woke before dawn, the sky a soft gray behind the trees. I walked the perimeter once more, checking the padlock, examining the fence for weaknesses, every sense heightened, every instinct alert. I felt like a sentinel, a guardian of something sacred. And in that quiet, before the world had fully woken, I realized the truth. Fear had its place, but courage was the choice. Every locked gate, every sign, every small act of defiance was a conscious decision to stand for myself. Later that afternoon, the HOA representatives arrived again, 2 cars rolling up the winding road like a slow, deliberate invasion. I could see them from the porch, clipboard in hand, faces carefully neutral but eyes sharp with scrutiny. Their presence felt heavier this time, more deliberate, as though they were testing not just the gate but my resolve, my patience, my very composure. I met them at the gate, standing taller than I felt. "You've come again," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We need to access the property," one of them said, his tone even almost polite. "It's for inspection and market purposes." I shook my head. "You've already done enough. You've entered without permission. You've overstepped. I will not allow it again. If you want to see the cabin, it will be on my terms." They paused, exchanging subtle glances, their eyes narrowing slightly. I felt the weight of their judgment, their unspoken disbelief that someone could refuse them outright. They were so used to compliance, to the silent acquiescence of homeowners who valued convenience over principle. I apparently was a rare exception. One of them sighed and stepped closer. "You're making this very difficult," he said carefully, almost like a warning. "No," I said firmly. You've overstepped your authority, and now you are demanding obedience that is not owed. This cabin is mine, this is my life, and I will protect it." For a long moment, silence hung between us. Then they left, retreating down the road with a quiet finality, leaving only the crunch of tires on gravel and the weight of tension in their wake. As the sun dipped low behind the treetops, painting the cabin in golden light, I realized the emotional toll of the confrontation. Fear, adrenaline, and defiance coexisted in a strange, exhausting harmony. I was proud of myself, but I was also painfully aware that the struggle was far from over. Every letter, every visit, every whisper in the neighborhood was another test of endurance. Neighbors had begun to notice more openly. Some stared from behind curtains, some whispered when I passed, some nodded silently, a subtle recognition of the boundary I was claiming. Isolation, I realized, had its price, but so did compromise, and some principles are worth standing alone for. That night I lit the fireplace and sat by the glow, the warmth doing little to thaw the chill that lingered in my chest. I thought about my father, about his lessons in patience and persistence. "Sometimes," he had said, "the people who push the hardest are the ones afraid of what they don't understand. Stand firm even if it feels lonely." I finally understood. The cabin wasn't just a home. It was a testament to resilience, to self-respect, to the quiet courage that refuses to bow to intimidation. Every padlock, every sign, every boundary I maintained was a declaration of self-worth. But I also knew the truth. The next step could be worse. They could escalate legally, socially, even personally. I had to be ready, not just to protect my property, but to protect my sense of self. To protect the part of me that refused to be manipulated, coerced, or erased. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the wind scrape against the windows and the distant hoot of an owl, I made a silent vow. I would not relent. The cabin was mine. Not by title alone, but by sweat, by memory, by unwavering resolve. And no amount of bureaucracy, judgment, or intimidation could ever change that. Because some things are worth standing up for, even when it's hard, even when it's exhausting, even when the world seems determined to break you. And sometimes, the quiet defiance of one person is enough to hold back an entire tide. Why does standing your ground feel like standing in a storm with nothing but a candle to shield you? By the sixth day, the quiet defiance I had clung to began to feel heavier. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now pulsed with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves against the roof, every distant car engine seemed to whisper threats I couldn't ignore. The HOA had grown bolder, sending not just letters, but emails, voicemails, even certified notices demanding access. Their words were polite, almost formal, but beneath the surface I could hear the subtle menace: comply or pay. I spent hours packing the cabin, trying to predict their next move. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath, the tall pines like silent witnesses to my turmoil. I thought of the mornings I had spent sanding floors until my hands were raw, the nights painting trim by lamplight, every memory embedded into these walls. And now, someone else wanted to treat those memories as negotiable. Late that afternoon, I noticed something unsettling, footprints along the driveway that hadn't been there before. Shallow, deliberate, cautious, someone had approached, likely testing whether my defenses would hold. My chest tightened. It wasn't just letters and threats anymore. Someone had crossed a boundary physically, a tangible reminder that the battle wasn't theoretical. I realized then that the conflict was no longer just about property. It had become psychological. They were testing me, trying to see how much I could endure, how much fear I could tolerate, how far they could push me before I folded. And somewhere deep inside, a small spark of anger flared, anger that fueled defiance but also dread. That evening, the HOA's property manager appeared at the gate, this time accompanied by another representative, a lawyer perhaps, judging by the sharp crease of his suit and the way he held himself. Their approach was slow, deliberate, like predators circling prey. "I'm here to discuss the cabin," one of them said, voice calm but calculated. "We need access for official purposes. The lock and sign, they cannot remain." I stood my ground, fingers brushing the padlock. "They will remain. This is my home, my terms. You will not enter without my permission." The lawyer spoke up, voice cool and precise. "You understand that continued obstruction could result in fines, liens, or legal action?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, and I understand that trying to control someone else's home without consent is overreach. I will not allow it. This cabin is mine. My memories, my labor, my life, it's all here. You may threaten me, but you will not erase what I've built." They lingered, exchanging subtle glances, the tension between us taut enough to snap. Their eyes betrayed frustration and disbelief, the quiet recognition that I wasn't just a homeowner. I was a wall they couldn't knock down easily. And for the first time, I felt a surge of power, tempered by exhaustion. I wasn't sure how long I could maintain this level of vigilance, but for now, I had drawn the line. After they left, the silence of the cabin felt almost sacred. I sank onto the porch, watching the sun dip behind the treetops, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. The padlock gleamed faintly, a symbol of defiance, a small but potent declaration. This is mine, and no one will take it without consent. Neighbors had begun to watch more openly. Some nodded as they passed, subtle acknowledgments of solidarity. Others whispered behind curtains, curiosity mixed with judgment. I realized that taking a stand always draws attention, sometimes admiration, sometimes scrutiny. And with attention comes pressure, sometimes unbearable. That night, as the wind rattled the windows and the cabin seemed to breathe around me, I understood something crucial. The real fight wasn't just against the HOA. It was against doubt, fatigue, and fear. The quiet erosion of resolve that comes when you are isolated, tested, and underestimated. And every moment I chose to stand firm, I fought not just for the cabin, but for the self that refused to be coerced. Sometimes protecting what's yours requires more than locks, signs, or letters. Sometimes it requires every ounce of courage you didn't know you had. And as I lay awake listening to the whispering forest, I made a silent vow. No matter what came next, I would endure. I would resist. I would not yield. Because some things, some people, some homes, some memories, are worth every moment of fear, every ounce of fatigue, every heartbeat of defiance. And my cabin was one of them. Why does it feel like the walls you built to protect yourself are suddenly closing in? By the seventh day, the cabin no longer felt like just a home. It had become a monument to stubbornness, pride, and principle. Every creak of the floorboards, every wind-whipped pine branch, every distant vehicle rolling down the road reminded me that the world outside the gate was watching and testing me. The HOA had escalated beyond letters and visits. Their tone had shifted into quiet, menacing persistence. It was no longer about policy. It was about control, about breaking me. I woke that morning to the faint sound of tires on gravel. My heart jumped. Someone was at the gate. I moved toward the window, cautious, the padlock gleaming in the morning light like a challenge to anyone daring enough to come close. Outside stood a familiar face, the HOA's property manager, clipboard in hand, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, a neighbor I barely knew, eyes sharp and measuring, lingered on the driveway. They wanted a show of authority. They wanted to intimidate. I felt a flush of fear, quickly replaced by defiance. "I need to see the property," the manager said, calm but firm, as though calmness alone could coerce compliance. "It's for inspection, for the community." I took a slow breath, fingers brushing the padlock. "This is my property. I will not allow entry without my permission. You have already violated that trust once. I will not let it happen again." He hesitated, clipboard shaking slightly. "You do realize the potential consequences?" I nodded, steadying my voice. "Yes, I also realize that violating someone's home without consent is far worse. You can write letters, you can send notices, you can threaten fines, but you cannot take my memories, my labor, my life. This cabin is mine." The neighbor shifted uneasily, then said quietly, "You're brave, I'll give you that." The words caught me off guard, an acknowledgement I hadn't expected, a subtle alliance in the middle of tension. But even as I registered that, the threat remained. The HOA's manager scribbled something on the clipboard and left, his retreat a silent warning that they weren't finished. Later that day, I walked the perimeter, the wind brushing my hair, the trees rustling like an audience holding its breath. The cabin, the gate, the padlock, they were symbols now. Not just of defiance, but of survival, of courage, of holding your ground when the world tells you to fold. Every creak in the floor, every chipped paint corner, every faint scratch on the porch spoke of countless hours of work, countless sacrifices, countless memories, and they were mine to defend. That evening I decided to escalate too, but differently. I took out my phone and started documenting everything: letters, notices, visits, footprints, conversations. Every act, every intrusion, every threat. I realized that while I had been defending the cabin physically, I had not yet defended it legally, emotionally, or publicly. I had the story now, and stories have power. Neighbors began to peek, whisper, and watch. I sensed curiosity, judgment, and even admiration. The cabin was no longer just a building, it was a statement. And the power in statements is subtle but unstoppable. One defiant person standing quietly can shift the energy of an entire neighborhood. Late at night, I sat by the fireplace, the glow flickering across the walls, casting long shadows. The weight of days pressed down on me, fatigue gnawing at the edges of my resolve. But beneath it, a strange exhilaration pulsed. I had drawn a line, and I had held it. I had looked fear in the face and refused to blink. And I realized something that both terrified and thrilled me. The cabin wasn't just mine because I had built it. It was mine because I had claimed it fiercely, stubbornly, without compromise. Every threat, every letter, every whispered judgment only reinforced what I already knew. Ownership isn't just a title. Ownership is courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand alone if necessary. As the wind rattled the windows and the pine needles tapped against the roof like anxious fingers, I made a quiet vow. No matter what they tried next, no matter how much pressure they brought, I would not bend. Not my home, not my memories, not my dignity. Because some things are more than buildings. They are life, sweat, love, and history. And my cabin, every nail, every beam, every corner was one of them. How do you win when the fight isn't just against rules, but against the quiet erosion of your sense of self? By the 8th day, everything had reached a tipping point. The cabin was no longer merely a place of residence. It was a fortress, a symbol, a declaration. Every letter, every footstep, every visitor from the HOA had hardened my resolve. Every moment of fear, doubt, and exhaustion had forged something stronger within me: certainty. That morning I stepped outside, padlock in hand, the for sale by owner sign swaying gently in the breeze. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp autumn air fill my lungs, and allowed myself a rare smile. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about asserting my life, my labor, my memories, my boundaries, and refusing to let them be taken lightly. The HOA arrived as expected, their cars rolling slowly down the winding road, clipboard-wielding representatives poised to assert control. But something had changed. I wasn't reacting with fear or hesitation. I stood at the gate, calm, deliberate, confident. "We need access," one of them said, voice clipped professional. "Your gate and signage are in violation of HOA policy." "I understand," I replied evenly. "But you've already accessed my property without permission. That's the violation. I will not allow it again." They scribbled on their clipboard, exchanged subtle glances, clearly frustrated by my unwavering stance. But I noticed something I hadn't before: hesitation, a faint crack in their armor of authority. They were used to compliance, to quiet acquiescence, to bending homeowners to their will. They were not used to resistance. I stepped forward slightly, letting the wind catch the edges of the sign, the padlock glinting in the morning sun. "This cabin is mine," I said, voice calm but resolute. "Every inch, every nail, every memory belongs to me. You cannot erase that, you cannot override it, and I will not allow it." There was a long pause. Silence hung heavy over the driveway, broken only by the distant rustle of pine needles and the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. Slowly, one of the representatives put down the clipboard, taking a step back. The other followed. They left without further words, cars fatting down the road, leaving me standing at the gate, victorious in a way that went beyond any legal win. I walked the perimeter, touching the fence posts, brushing my hand along the gate. Every inch of it felt alive again, restored to its rightful place in my life. I realized then what I had truly won: not just the right to control access, but the reclamation of dignity, of self-respect, of ownership in the deepest sense. Neighbors began to nod as they passed, some quietly whispering, others offering small smiles of recognition. The whispers, once threatening, now seemed tinged with admiration. They had seen me stand firm, unwavering, and it mattered. My solitary battle had become a quiet lesson. Courage is contagious, defiance can inspire, and standing your ground, even when it's hard, is sometimes the greatest story you can tell. That evening I sat on the porch, the wind brushing through the pines, the sunset casting golden streaks across the cabin walls. The padlock gleamed, the sign swayed, and the cabin felt like a home again, not because it was protected by locks or rules, but because it was honored by resolve. I thought about the days behind me, the fear, the tension, the quiet loneliness of standing alone against an institution. I thought about the lessons I had learned, that ownership is more than legal titles, that dignity is worth defending, and that sometimes the strongest walls are not made of wood or steel, but of determination and principle. Sometimes victory doesn't look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like calm, unwavering resistance. Sometimes it's in claiming your story, your boundaries, your life, and refusing to let anyone write it for you. I stood and walked to the edge of the property, looking out at the forest, at the road, at the small cabin I had fought for so fiercely. A sense of peace settled over me, quiet and profound. The cabin had survived. I had survived. And in protecting it, I had discovered something even greater: the strength to protect myself, to honor my own voice, and to assert without compromise what is mine. Because some things, some homes, some memories, some principles, are worth every moment of fear, every heartbeat of defiance, every ounce of courage. And my cabin, every nail, every beam, every whispered memory, was one of them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.